It was one of those Flaxborough afternoons when the town, having exhausted its usual reserves of gossip, fell back upon plants. The annual garden show, held this year in the draughty parish hall adjoining Blackfriars Abbey, had attracted the predictable mixture of earnest amateurs, competitive spinsters, and husbands marooned among begonias while wondering if the public bar of the Blue Lion might still be serving cold beef sandwiches. At precisely 3 o'clock, as the mayor prepared to bestow a ribbon upon the largest marrow, an interruption occurred. Not a dramatic interruption, for Flaxborough did not specialize in those, but a sufficiently curious one to trouble the town's equilibrium. The ribbon cutter, a Canon Smalley of Blackfriars Abbey, had failed to appear. Canon Smalley was not a man often noticed until absent. Tall, kindly, and possessing the singular ability to look both weary and benevolent at once, he had been a fixture of the Abbey for 3 decades. Parishioners knew his sermons for their brevity and his pastoral visits for their preference for sherry over spiritual admonition. He was, in short, unobjectionable. Thus his non-appearance struck several in the hall as faintly unseemly, and several more as positively rude. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Spratt, remarked in tones intended to travel, "One does expect clergy to manage their time better than common tradesmen." By 3:30 the marrow lay unadorned, the mayor's scissors unopened, and whispers swelled like a draught beneath the parish hall's beams. Where was Canon Smalley? Mrs. Glossop, a retired schoolmistress whose speciality was roses rather than tact, declared she had seen him that very morning walking briskly along the High Street. Mr. Larch, proprietor of the ironmongers, maintained that he had been promised a visit that same afternoon regarding the purchase of a new coal scuttle for the Abbey vestry. Meanwhile, Miss Teatwell, who took in typing, claimed to have heard from her cousin that the canon had lately been troubled by matters of conscience, which in Flaxborough covered everything from unpaid bills to scandalous affection for women who danced. The mayor, having shuffled in embarrassment and coughed into his gold chain, announced that the marrow would have to make do without clerical blessing. The ribbon was cut, applause was attempted, and the band struck up an uncertain rendering of Rule Britannia. Yet the absence of Canon Smalley hung in the air more persistently than the scent of chrysanthemums. By early evening, the matter had become irresistible fodder for every teacup and beer glass in town. Was the canon ill? Had he been summoned to some episcopal emergency? Or had he— Here Miss Teatwell lowered her voice theatrically at the Blue Lion Lounge— simply vanished? It was at this stage, with speculation rising towards feverish respectability, that Sergeant Love, fresh-faced and diligent as ever, was dispatched to make discreet inquiries at the Abbey. His return, 2 hours later, furnished no comfort. Canon Smalley, he reported, was not at home, nor in the church, nor in any place where one might reasonably expect to locate a man of the cloth. His hat and coat remained in their accustomed place. His bed had not been slept in the previous night. Inspector Pubright, summoned from his own modest supper of cold ham and pickles, received the report with his customary mildness. He asked no more than 2 questions: whether the canon had a bicycle, he did not, and whether the Abbey possessed a cellar. It did, but the sergeant had not thought to look. "Then perhaps," Pubright suggested, "we had better take a lantern or feet." Notion of a priest mislaid among damp barrels of communion wine lent Flaxborough a shiver, both thrilling and discomforting. Within the hour, as dusk thickened across the cobbled streets, the inspector and his sergeant were observed heading towards the Abbey, their figures small and deliberate against the looming soot-blackened stones. Somewhere within, perhaps, lay the canon, or perhaps not. In Flaxborough, absences were rarely as innocent as they first appeared. Chapter 2 began not with a discovery in the Abbey cellar, as some of the more dramatic minds in town might have hoped, but with the absence of any discovery at all. Inspector Pubright and Sergeant Love had poked dutifully about among the coal dust, empty bottles, and ecclesiastical clutter beneath the Abbey, but the canon had not materialized. Not so much as a misplaced cassock or sermon note lay to hint at his whereabouts. By the following morning, however, Flaxborough had already furnished its own, vastly more colourful conclusions. The Abbey's failure to produce its priest had become, overnight, a matter of civic theatre. At the confectioner's, Mrs. Glossop insisted that Canon Smalley had always looked the sort of man to do something sudden. At the hairdresser's, Miss Teatwell was overheard suggesting he had run off to join a Roman mission in Italy, though she could not recall which one. Meanwhile, at the snug bar of the Blue Lion, a retired railway porter declared he had once seen the canon counting money with suspicious haste, like a man about to abscond. Sergeant Love, hearing these tidbits as he made his morning rounds, reported them with a seriousness out of proportion to their value. Pubright, listening while stirring sugar into his tea, made no comment beyond a faint smile. He knew from long experience that Flaxborough preferred its mysteries extravagant and its explanations tidy. Life, however, often supplied the reverse. Mid-morning, the first official inquiry took place. Mrs. Spratt, the vicar's wife, was summoned to the police station, not unwillingly, for she relished occasions on which her sense of order could be of use. She arrived wearing a hat that spoke less of fashion than of civic responsibility. Canon Smalley, Pubright began politely, seems to have been in good health of late. Entirely, she replied, though her tone suggested he might nevertheless have been guilty of negligence in not presenting himself at the garden show. He breakfasted as usual the day before yesterday, a boiled egg, toast, marmalade. I do not believe he touched the kippers. Did he appear preoccupied? Pubright inquired gently. Mrs. Spratt considered. Not more than ordinarily, though he did receive a letter. This, naturally, stirred the sergeant to attention. "What kind of letter, madam?" She pursed her lips. "From a woman, or at least the handwriting was feminine." He tucked it away rather quickly. At this, Pubright inclined his head with polite interest, but refrained from pressing. Mrs. Spratt, however, was eager to oblige. "Of course one does hear things," she went on, lowering her voice to a level that still carried across the station office. There were whispers. Some said Canon Smalley had been seen in the company of Mrs. Palathorpe, a widow, and not at all the sort to require spiritual guidance beyond the polite minimum. When Mrs. Spratt had departed, leaving behind a faint aroma of lavender and moral disapproval, Sergeant Love asked in puzzled tones whether he ought to call upon this Mrs. Palathorpe at once. "In due course, love," said Pubright, folding in his spectacles. "But let us not gallop after every whisper. People who vanish seldom do so by accident, and those who discuss them seldom do so without motive." That afternoon, the Abbey was revisited, this time in the company of the church. Verger, Mr. Cobbold, whose thin frame and perpetually mournful expression gave the impression of a man rehearsing for his own funeral. He confirmed that the canon had not been seen since the previous morning, and that nothing within the church seemed disturbed, save perhaps the absence of a silver candlestick that usually stood upon the south altar. This detail, introduced almost apologetically, did not trouble the verger greatly, but it interested Pubright enough to provoke a faint lift of his eyebrows. Sergeant Love, meanwhile, looked ready to draft an entire report on theft, scandal, and clerical flight all at once. By evening, the story had advanced further in the telling than in the facts. According to one version, the canon had fled abroad, with the candlestick and a widow's dowry. According to another, he had been spirited away by agents of Rome to answer for unspecified heresies, and at the Blue Lion, where suspicion and ale fermented together, the prevailing opinion was that Canon Smalley was concealed somewhere very near indeed, waiting for his chance to reappear and explain everything with a calm smile, just the sort of thing, the townsfolk said, a priest would be bound to do. Inspector Pubright, however, remained in no doubt that explanations, when they came, would prove less pious and rather more human. Inspector Pubright, having spent the better part of his morning with parish gossip neatly catalogued in his head, set out to conduct those quiet conversations which to him mattered rather more than candle missing or marrow unblessed. He was a man who preferred his clues not on fingerprints or footprints, but on intonation, hesitation, and the manner in which respectable people betrayed themselves when trying very hard not to. The first stop was Mrs. Pallithorpe's residence, a tidy brick villa on the edge of the Abbey grounds, its curtains of the kind that were always just a little too firmly drawn. The widow, when she appeared at the door, was of the florid and carefully corseted variety. She greeted Pubright with a smile that hovered uncertainly between welcome and apprehension. "Inspector," she said, "how very unexpected." Pubright bowed slightly. "I trust I am not disturbing you, madam. I should be grateful for a few moments of conversation. It concerns Canon Smalley." Her colour heightened at once. She led him to a sitting-room perfumed with violets and furnished with a faintly anxious tidiness. Sergeant Love, who followed with notebook poised, sat carefully on the edge of a chair and looked about for incriminating clues in the antimacassars. Mrs. Pallithorpe did not wait to be questioned. If people are saying things, wicked, idle, things about myself and the canon, I should hope you will not give them credit. A woman in my position must expect malicious tongues, but really, Inspector, I will not have my name made sport of. Quite understandable, Pubright murmured. I wonder, though, when you last saw Canon Smalley. She hesitated just a fraction too long. Why, at service, naturally, last Sunday. Pubright looked mildly regretful. I had been given to understand that he visited you rather more recently. At this, she adjusted a cushion, then another, before conceding. He called, yes, 2 days ago. It was only to inquire after my garden. The canon takes a kindly interest in such things. I have roses, you see. He admired them. Sergeant Love, whose idea of clerical behaviour leaned towards hymn books rather than horticulture, frowned and scribbled. Pubright inclined his head. Did he seem himself? Well, she began, then stopped. I thought perhaps he seemed troubled, but then one imagines things. He said nothing. There the conversation paused, with Mrs. Pallithorpe dabbing her forehead with a lace handkerchief and Pubright gazing with polite vagueness at a photograph on the mantelpiece. The photograph showed a man, presumably the late Mr. Pallithorpe, wearing a moustache so large it seemed to have survived his person. Pubright rose, thanked her for her candour, and departed with no more disturbance than a draught. The next enquiry took him across town to the ironmonger's. Mr. Larch, proprietor, prided himself on plain speaking, which in practice meant a constant undertone of aggrievement. He stood behind his counter, polishing a row of kettles, and received the inspector with what he imagined was businesslike forthrightness. Yes, Canon Smalley promised to come round, he said at once, before, Pubright had asked. Said he wanted a coal scuttle for the vestry, very particular about it being both dignified and cheap. That was Tuesday. Never came, of course. Typical. Typical of the canon? Pubright inquired gently. Typical of clergy, snapped Mr. Larch. "Fine talk, poor follow-through. I've a living to make, Inspector. If every customer vanished into thin air, where would I be?" Pubright refrained from suggesting an answer. He only asked whether the canon had seemed agitated. Agitated? No, just absent-minded like they all are. Couldn't tell a decent hinge from a doorstop. But I'll say this, he had a way of looking over his shoulder, as if he thought someone was listening in. This observation Pubright received with a mild "indeed" before buying a packet of screws he did not require in order not to spoil Mr. Larch's day entirely. By the time the inspector returned to the station, dusk was descending, and Sergeant Love had accumulated pages of notes that, to his mind, pointed towards a single, neat conclusion. The canon, overburdened by some private matter, likely a lady, had absconded, taking a candlestick for company. Pubright, meanwhile, leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers. "Love," he said gently, "when a man of the cloth disappears, people assume sin. When property vanishes, people assume theft. But we must be careful not to confuse appearance with truth. Sometimes what people omit to say is as telling as what they blurt out." The sergeant, not for the first time, wrote down this remark without the faintest idea of its meaning, and thus, as evening deepened, Flaxborough's missing canon grew no nearer to reappearing, but around him the town's voices swelled ever louder, weaving their contradictory tales, each eager to be the first to know what none of them yet could. The following day opened with an optimism the townsfolk of Flaxborough always mustered in the face of calamity. They were convinced that mysteries like colds either cleared up on their own or could be cured by sufficient attention, and attention the disappearance of Canon Smalley received in abundance. By breakfast time, the gossip had hardened into consensus. Mrs. Palathorpe was, if not directly responsible, then certainly adjacent to whatever mischief had spirited the canon away. The speed with which suspicion settled upon the widow owed less to evidence than to her disconcerting habit of surviving her husband with apparent ease, her roses thriving with indecent vigour, and her curtains being, as several ladies whispered, darkly, far too frequently drawn. In the police station, Sergeant Love presented this general opinion to Pubright as though it were a preliminary charge sheet. "Sir, it does all add up, doesn't it? She sees him last, she admits he seemed troubled, and she lives nearest the Abbey. If you ask me, that candlestick will be found in her coal shed." Pubright listened with his customary mildness, his round face betraying nothing more than polite interest. "And do you suppose, love, that a widow who entertains a clergyman in her parlour would then choose to dispose of him in her coal shed?" Love frowned. "Well, people do surprising things, sir." "Indeed they do," Pubright agreed softly. "But seldom the surprising thing everyone expects. Nevertheless, procedure demanded that Mrs. Palathorpe be seen again. This time, Pubright called not at her villa but invited her, with unfailing courtesy, to the station. She arrived wearing a hat of fresh determination and a fur piece whose fox head stared balefully at the inspector throughout. "Mrs. Palathorpe," Pubright began, "I am most grateful for your assistance the other day. Might I trouble you for one or two further details?" She sat upright, defiant. "If this is about the canon again, I have already told you everything. We spoke of roses. He seemed out of sorts, that is all." Pubright nodded gravely. "Forgive me. It is only that others have spoken of seeing you and the canon together rather more frequently." Her eyes flickered just briefly, before narrowing. "People will say anything, Inspector, particularly those with empty afternoons." "Of course," Pubright said with unyielding calm. "Yet it must be inconvenient for you being subject to such attention." "Inconvenient?" she almost snapped. "It is scandalous! Why should I, a respectable widow, be maligned by curtain twitchers? I have done nothing." Pubright let the silence rest as though weighing her protestations. "Only then did—" he asked. "Might you know if the canon had other obligations? A debt, perhaps, or an entanglement?" Mrs. Palethorpe drew in her breath sharply. "If he did, it is nothing to do with me." And with that she stood, her dignity only slightly undermined by the fox's glassy stare, and left. Love looked to his superior. "If that isn't guilty behaviour, sir, I don't know what is." Pubright smiled faintly. "It may be guilt, or it may be outrage at being thought guilty. They do resemble each other, Love, particularly in respectable people." Meanwhile, Flaxborough's grapevine flowered unchecked. At the confectioner's, it was said the widow had lured the canon into a compromising position and struck him with the candlestick itself. At the haberdashery, the theory ran to secret marriage proposals and subsequent flight. At the Blue Lion, emboldened by lunchtime ale, it was claimed that Canon Smalley had been kept prisoner in Mrs. Palethorpe's spare room, subsisting on weak tea and seed cake. By dusk, the town had settled comfortably into its choice of villain. The widow's name was spoken with relish, her roses eyed as if each bloom might conceal a clergyman's collar. Only Pubright, quietly attending to his paperwork, remained unconvinced. As he remarked to Love before leaving for the evening, "The trouble with an obvious suspect, Love, is that they so rarely turn out to be the right one. People are not generally obliging enough to solve their own mysteries for us." The following morning, Flaxborough awoke with its appetite for scandal sharpened still further. The newspapers had at last deigned to mention Canon Smalley's absence, though in a tone of mild reproach, as though a clergyman had no business causing disruption by vanishing inconveniently. The Flaxborough Gazette confined itself to a 3-inch column beneath an advertisement for patent liver pills. Cleric missing, Abbey Canon not seen. Since Tuesday, police make discreet inquiries. The article offered nothing new, but its mere appearance was enough to elevate the affair from gossip to civic crisis. Inspector Pubright, however, remained serenely unhurried. He began his day not with suspects or witnesses, but with the Abbey itself, preferring to linger in the cool shadows of its nave before the verger commenced dusting. It was here, as his eyes adjusted to the gloom, that he noticed something curiously misplaced. A chair. Not just any chair, but a simple oak seat usually stationed by the north wall. It now stood awkwardly near the south altar, angled as though set down in haste. Most visitors would not have registered it, but Pubright, with his taste for the unremarked, paused. He moved the chair gently back to its accustomed place, then examined the flagstones where it had been standing. A faint smear of candle wax glistened against the stone. It was no proof of crime, merely of someone's impatience or clumsiness, yet the inspector's interest stirred. Candlesticks did not vanish of their own accord, and chairs did not shift themselves across churches. He made a note in his small leather book, wrote nothing of conclusions, and left as quietly as he had entered. Later that morning he called on Mr. Cobbold the verger once again. The man's sepulchral air had deepened since their last meeting, as though the absence of his priest were a personal bereavement. "Mr. Cobbold," Pubright asked gently, "have you lately moved any furniture in the Abbey?" The verger looked offended at the suggestion. "Certainly not, Inspector. Each chair has its place. I have my routine. Disturbance of such order would be... He trailed off, searching for the word. "Unseemly?" Pubright supplied. "Exactly." "And yet," the inspector murmured, "one chair was out of place this morning. The verger's brows furrowed in honest bewilderment. "Then it was not by my doing, perhaps," Pubright said mildly. "Someone else's late at night." The remark left Cobbold pale, but silent. Meanwhile, Sergeant Love had been busy with the more conventional side of investigation, interviews with townsfolk of ever-dwindling relevance. He returned at noon, flushed with the excitement of minor revelations. "Sir, I've spoken with Mrs. Glossop. She says she saw the canon on Tuesday afternoon carrying a parcel wrapped in brown paper." "Quite large. Might have been that candlestick." Pubright nodded, eyes thoughtful. "Or a parcel of fish, love. One must not underestimate the prosaic." "Yes, sir, but—" Love hesitated, then pressed on. "Mrs. Glossop says he looked nervous. Said he nearly dropped it when she called his name." "That," Pubright said with faint amusement, "is more suggestive. The small oddities, the letter swiftly pocketed, the sidelong glances, the chair moved in haste, began to collect in his mind like pieces of a puzzle whose picture was still obscured. He offered no summary, but merely asked Love to make a note of times and places with emphasis on Tuesday. By late afternoon, Flaxborough's certainty in Mrs. Palthorpe's guilt had begun to suffer its first tremor. The discovery of the canon's missing candlestick was now being embroidered into theories of burglary, foreign agents, or even parishioner vengeance. One rumour had it that a dissatisfied choirboy's father had exacted retribution for years of missed solos. Another insisted that the canon had been seen boarding a bus to the coast, where he was no doubt disguised as a holiday-maker in sandals. Pubright, however, preferred his evidence less dramatic. He sat in his office with the faintest of smiles, his thoughts circling back to that chair by the altar, an ordinary piece of wood, slightly out of place, yet somehow whispering of haste, secrecy, and perhaps of a man whose vanishing had been less voluntary than others believed. He closed his notebook, and with it the day's inquiries, remarking only to Love, "It is the trivial things, Love, that insist upon being remembered." By Thursday, the town of Flaxborough was in a condition of almost festive unease. With each day that Canon Smalley remained unaccounted for, the appetite for theories swelled like yeast in a too-warm pantry. People began volunteering information in the manner of citizens eager to assist the police, though what they offered was often more illuminating of themselves than of the canon. Inspector Pubright, who understood this tendency better than most, spent the day allowing the cast of Flaxborough to parade their suspicions. First came Councillor Harbottle, a man with the constitution of a wine barrel and the solemnity of a chapel organ. He called at the station uninvited, declaring that in his opinion the Abbey has grown lax. When a clergyman disappears, it is the fault of loose discipline. Too much tolerance of modernity, Inspector. Television in the vestry, I've no doubt. He proposed a full inquiry into the church's financial management and hinted darkly that the canon may have been spirited away by parties who prefer their accounts left unexamined. Pubright listened with politeness, agreed that bookkeeping was indeed a serious matter, and allowed Harbottle to puff himself back into the street none the wiser. Later, Miss Teatwell, the typing lady with ears sharpened by both curiosity and cup handles, presented herself. She leaned across the counter to whisper that she had it on authority, her cousin, in Utterbridge, that Canon Smalley had been corresponding with a woman in Lincoln. A widow, Inspector, but not Mrs. Palthorpe. He travelled to meet her once. On the omnibus. She blinked significantly as though omnibus journeys themselves were suggestive of moral lapse. Pubright thanked her gravely, made a note, and wondered idly what proportion of widows in Lincoln were currently being eyed with suspicion by their neighbours. By mid-afternoon, the inspector and Sergeant Love visited the Abbey precinct again, this time to speak with Mr. Doughty, the church organist. A thin, Nervous man with nicotine-stained fingers, he greeted them in the vestry with the air of someone long accustomed to complaint. "Canon Smalley?" he repeated, adjusting his spectacles. "Oh, yes, he confided in me, said he'd been troubled
by bills, heating the Abbey, costs the earth. I told him, raise the choir boys' fees, but he wouldn't. Too soft."
"Bills?" Pubright repeated, his tone blandly sympathetic. "So the canon worried about money?" "Oh, constantly," Doughty replied, though he would never admit it to the congregation. And then there was the missing silver. He mentioned
it. Quite upset. Said if it were not found, he would have to... The organist stopped, realizing too late that he had strayed into dangerous confession. Would have to...
Pubright prompted gently, but Doughty shook his head and busied himself with his cigarette tin, muttering that he had best not say more. That evening, while Pubright was still reflecting on the day's conversations, a deputation of 3 ladies from the Mothers' Union called at the station, each competing to speak louder than the other. Their joint opinion was that the canon had been prey to outsiders, a term which seemed to encompass everyone not born in Flaxborough, and possibly a few who had been. They feared he had been enticed away to some cultish enterprise, or worse, to London. The inspector allowed them full rein, their voices weaving together like a trio of argumentative linnets, before bowing them out with a courteous promise that every avenue was being pursued. By the time dusk fell, the field of suspicion had broadened impressively. There were mutterings of theft, romantic indiscretion, ecclesiastical conspiracy, unpaid gas bills, and abduction by foreigners. Yet through it all, Purbright's mind returned quietly to one small image. A chair moved in haste and a smear of wax upon stone. He closed his notebook for the evening, remarking to Love as they locked the station door, "It is not the width of the field that matters, Love, but the depth of a single footprint. We shall see in time which of these worthy citizens has trodden too heavily." And outside, Flaxborough settled into its lamplit evening routine, pub chatter, tea in sitting rooms, curtains twitching, while behind it all lingered the sense that the Abbey's silence was heavier than stone. The Friday morning edition of the Flaxborough Citizen carried, with what it fondly imagined to be journalistic restraint, the headline, "Canon Still Missing, Police Make No Statement." Beneath, of course, was a full column of speculation that amounted to several statements, all highly unverified. Readers learned that the canon was known to be a man of private anxieties, that he had once been seen in conversation with a stranger on the Utterbridge Road, and that a parishioner had recently observed a light in the Abbey vestry at a most unseasonable hour. The effect was less to inform than to persuade the town that the disappearance was both sinister and somehow everyone's business. Inspector Pubright read the article over his boiled egg, sighing at the familiar spectacle of the press supplying what it claimed the police had denied. By the time he reached the station, he had resolved to let the town's appetite for conjecture run its course while he and Sergeant Love kept to the quieter business of evidence. It was Love, in fact, who brought that morning's first tangible piece of progress. He appeared at Purbright's office door carrying a brown paper parcel, which he placed on the desk with a certain ceremonial care. "From Mr. Blenkinsop, sir, the verger. Says he found it tucked under the organ stool." Pubright unwrapped the package slowly, revealing a silver chalice, tarnished but unmistakably of ecclesiastical design. On the rim clung a dull smear of candle wax. "Missing from the vestry cupboard, I believe," Pubright murmured. He lifted the chalice delicately. "And hidden, you say, beneath the organist's perch?" "Most curious," Love shifted. "Doughty's."
"Stool, sir?" "Quite," said Pubright. That discovery gave the inspector a reason to revisit the Abbey, and by mid-morning he was in the organ loft with Mr. Doughty, who seemed even more nervous than on his previous interview. "I've no idea how that could have come there, Inspector,"
Doughty protested, wringing his hands into shapes oddly reminiscent of fugues. "I never go rummaging under the stool. Dust is all one finds there. Well, and now this, apparently." Pubright regarded him kindly. "One wonders who would wish to tuck the chalice there if not its owner of the seat." "I swear to you, I never!" cried Doughty, his spectacles misted with panic. "Canon Smalley must have— oh dear, no, that cannot be said." "Cannot?" Pubright inquired. The organist pressed his lips shut like an overplayed accordion and would elaborate no further. That afternoon, another matter presented itself. A postman brought to the station a small envelope addressed in Canon Smalley's hand to Mrs. Palathorpe. It had been misdirected to Utterbridge and only now arrived back in Flaxborough. With Mrs. Palathorpe's consent, Pubright slit it open. Inside was a short note, dated the very day before the Canon's disappearance. "Dear Mrs. Palathorpe, would you be so kind as to call upon me this Thursday evening after evensong? I have need of your good sense and trust you will not fail me. Yours sincerely, Cyril Smalley." Pubright read it twice, then handed it to Love. "There, Love, is a more definite appointment than most men contrive in a lifetime. Yet Mrs. Palathorpe says she never kept it." Which leaves us wondering, did the Canon wait, and if so, who came in her stead? By evening, the inspector felt the case had altered in character. A clergyman who mislaid himself was one thing, a chalice smuggled beneath an organ stool, and a misdelivered letter summoning a confidant were another. Something furtive had passed within the Abbey walls, something not accounted for by the town's chatter of widows, gas bills, or cults. Pubright stood a while in the marketplace, watching the lamps kindle one by one. Around him the shops shuttered, couples hurried, home with groceries, and the newsboys called their headlines. The town moved with its ordinary rhythms, yet behind its windows whispers coiled. The inspector, hands clasped behind his back, turned towards the station, murmuring, "The Canon was not stolen from Flaxborough, Love. He was, if I may borrow a term from Mr. Doughty's trade, transposed." It was Saturday morning when Sergeant Love, looking unusually purposeful, came into Purbright's office carrying a cardboard box. The inspector, who had been perusing the churchwarden's accounts with the sort of grim fascination one reserves for archaeological relics, regarded the box with polite suspicion. "What have we there, Love?" "Milk bottles, sir, collected from the Abbey yard." "Evidence of a spiritual thirst?" Pubright suggested mildly. Love shook his head. "All broken, and not recent. They were under the ivy by the vestry door. Thought you'd like to know." Pubright raised his eyebrows. "Ah, shards among the shadows, but milk bottles, you say? Hardly ecclesiastical contraband." "No, sir. But it seemed odd. Someone smashing a lot of them all in the same corner. Not the sort of place children would dare play, is it?" the inspector agreed. The Abbey yard had about it a chill discouragement to games. Moreover, the broken glass had lain carefully gathered, not scattered. Someone had made the effort to break the bottles deliberately and then heap them, almost tidily, by the wall. A ritual act, perhaps, or at least an act with intention. Pubright went that morning to call on Mrs. Palathorpe once again. She received him in her drawing-room, which exhaled lavender, reproach, and faint triumph. "Inspector," she said, with the air of one doing society a favour, "I have thought further upon poor Canon Smalley's note. You are aware, of course, that I could not possibly have gone to the Abbey Thursday night. My social obligations were of the firmest order. Indeed, madam, you have made that plain. Yet the Canon clearly expected your presence. Mrs. Palathorpe, permitted herself a smile that implied benevolence mingled with pity. Canon Smalley was, if I may be forgiven, a man frequently misguided in his expectations. And what do you suppose might he have wanted of you? She hesitated a fraction too long before answering. Guidance, Inspector. He was not always the steadiest in his judgment. It was, in Pirbright's opinion, as close as the lady would ever come to hinting at scandal. He took his leave, but not before observing in a corner of her cabinet a chalice-shaped silver sugar bowl polished to a glow that outshone her smile. That afternoon, Pirbright and Love interviewed the verger again. Mr. Blenkinsop was a small, stooped man whose manner combined civility with a permanent air of grievance. He admitted to knowing about the chalice's disappearance earlier than he had confessed. "Well, sir, I didn't want to cause upset. The canon had enough on his mind, he did. Kept muttering about being betrayed, he did. 'I shall be betrayed, Blenkinsop,' he says." "That's the very word, betrayed," Pirbright repeated. "Yes."
"Sir? Said it twice so I'd remember. Course I didn't rightly know what he meant." Love looked significantly at his superior.
But Pirbright, expression unreadable, only thanked the verger and moved on. By the close of day, two matters had settled uneasily in Pirbright's mind. One, that Canon Smalley had anticipated treachery from some quarter very close at hand. Two, that the odd deposit of broken milk bottles might not be unrelated. He walked once more past the abbey in the dusk, pausing by the vestry wall. He crouched and ran his finger along the mortar. Embedded in it was a faint smear, waxy pale, almost like fat. A candle had guttered there. The inspector straightened, eyes travelling upward to the darkened window of the vestry. Behind that stone wall something clandestine had been enacted, and in the quiet of a provincial town secrecy had grown into disappearance. Pirbright returned to the station, his step unhurried, but his mind sharpened. He found Love waiting with the evening's report. "Any progress, sir?" "Yes, Love," Pirbright replied. "Of a sort. The canon's disappearance is beginning to sound less like a loss of direction, and more like the fulfillment of an appointment. With whom, however, remains the question." He laid the broken milk bottle shard on his desk blotter, where it glinted balefully in the lamplight. "We are dealing," he murmured, "with a mystery that does not crack so much as it splinters." Sunday arrived in Flaxborough with a crispness that encouraged both church-going and whispering. The town, having slept fitfully through the week's developments, now spilled its curiosity into the abbey pews. Parishioners murmured among themselves, glancing at empty corners where Canon Smalley would ordinarily preside. Mothers nudged children, elders exchanged knowing looks, and the church organ hummed with a nervous undercurrent of anticipation. Pirbright arrived early, accompanied by Sergeant Love, whose spectacles had begun to fog from the brisk autumn air. The inspector did not go to sit in the vestry. Rather, he took his accustomed place at the back, hands folded behind his back, observing. The congregation settled, though not quietly. Mrs. Glossop whispered to Mrs. Spratt about the canon's likely fate, suggesting a hurried flight with Mrs. Pallithorpe's complicity. Mr. Larch muttered under his breath about the scandalous expense of church repairs, insisting that theft was inevitable when money was at stake. Meanwhile, a group of choir boys clustered near the font, exchanging exaggerated theories involving kidnappers and foreign intrigue. Pirbright, noting these currents of opinion, remained entirely impassive. He allowed the murmurs to rise, the glances to flicker, and the eyebrows to arch. Human nature, he knew, was always more forthcoming than the honest witness. When the sermon began, delivered in a neutral, rehearsed tone by the substitute priest, Pirbright's attention wandered to minor details that others ignored. A book left open on the lectern, slightly skewed, a cushion on a pew not quite aligned with its fellows, and, most telling, a faint smell of wax that seemed to drift upward. From the vestry door, at the close of the service, he lingered while the congregation dispersed. He asked to speak briefly with the verger, Mr. Blenkinsop, who looked more apprehensive than ever. "Sir," Pirbright began in his usual quiet manner, "I wonder if you might recall the canon's movements just before his disappearance. Anything."
That seemed out of the ordinary. The verger blinked, and for the first time a shadow passed across his otherwise imperturbable face. "Well, so there was one thing. Canon Smalley, he asked me to fetch a box from the vestry.
Said it contained something he feared might be stolen. I thought he meant the chalice, sir, but he seemed uneasy. Did you see him with it?" "No, sir. I was called away just after he took it." "He carried it himself." Pirbright nodded, his mind piecing together the timeline. The canon's careful, secretive movements, the misplaced chair, the wax on the flagstone, the misdelivered note to Mrs. Palathorpe, all converged into a pattern that was beginning to suggest a deliberate orchestration rather than accident. Later, that afternoon, Pirbright returned to the Abbey alone. He crouched beneath the vestry window, examining the mortar and flagstones, the faint wax smears now familiar to him. He noted the direction of the chair's displacement, the tracks left in the dust, and the placement of the organ stool. Each item, trivial in isolation, now aligned to form a chain of subtle but undeniable evidence. By evening he had drafted a plan. It required careful questioning, timing, and a small measure of theatre. The guilty party, he suspected, would reveal themselves not by confession, but by the involuntary gestures of conscience. Sergeant Love, looking anxious, inquired if Pirbright had identified the culprit. The inspector only smiled faintly. "We are approaching the moment, Love, when truth will step into the light of its own accord." Meanwhile, we observe. Outside, Flaxborough's street lamps flickered on, casting their golden haze over the cobbled roads. The town carried on its routines, unaware that the mystery of the vanished canon was poised to reach a critical juncture. Monday dawned grey and damp, a sky like washed linen over Flaxborough. Inspector Pirbright, his coat buttoned high and umbrella tucked under one arm, arrived at the station early, mindful that the coming day might require a subtle performance rather than mere note-taking. He spent the first hour reviewing the week's interviews and his own observations, the chalice hidden under the organ stool, the misplaced chair, the wax smear, the canon's misdelivered note. Each minor anomaly, once trivial, now formed a lattice upon which the truth might be displayed. Sergeant Love, eager for action, could hardly contain himself. "Sir, do you really think we can catch the person responsible today? The town seems—" "Convinced Mrs. Palathorpe did it." Pirbright smiled faintly, not unkindly. "Love, the town's convictions are rarely trustworthy. Our task is to observe, to listen, and to create circumstances under which the guilty conscience may inadvertently speak. Patience, my dear fellow, is the instrument of detection." By mid-morning, Pirbright had arranged a meeting at the Abbey. Mrs. Palathorpe had received a polite invitation to view certain items recovered from the vestry and to provide her insights. The lady arrived, hat perched jauntily, with an air of cautious curiosity. "I must say, Inspector," she began, "I am puzzled as to why I am summoned. I have been nothing but helpful, and yet the canon remains missing." "Precisely, madam," Pirbright replied smoothly. "And that is why your observations may be invaluable. Perhaps you can help us understand certain irregularities. Consider this a matter of clarification, nothing more." He guided her gently to the vestry, where the chalice sat on a small table, gleaming despite the faint wax residue. Nearby, the chair rested exactly as it had been displaced the day the canon vanished. Pubright allowed her eyes to linger on it, observing with quiet satisfaction the minute twitch of her fingers as they brushed the edge of the chair. "And these," Pubright said, indicating the chalice, "were hidden rather artfully. One might suppose the person who did so wished to ensure they were discovered only by those who knew precisely what to look for." Mrs. Palathorpe's eyes narrowed imperceptibly. "I'm not sure what you mean, Inspector." Pubright stepped closer, hands folded. "It is not my role to accuse before the evidence speaks, but consider, Canon Smalley left a note for you, yes? He expected your presence, and yet you were not there. Who then came to that appointment?"
"In your stead. The person who carried the chalice, who moved the chair, who left wax upon the flagstone, might they have sought to conceal something?"
Her composure faltered almost imperceptibly, and she inhaled with the sharp, measured breath of someone recalling an inconvenient memory. Pubright allowed a beat to pass before continuing. A man of the cloth, accustomed to discretion, anticipating betrayal, would naturally act with both caution and speed. Those who witness such precision rarely fail to betray themselves in the smallest gestures. Mrs. Palathorpe shifted her weight, glanced at the chalice, then the chair, and for a fraction of a second her lips pressed into a thin line. That was all Pubright required. He had seen enough. "Thank you, madam," he said, bowing slightly. "Your presence has clarified matters remarkably." As she departed, still maintaining a semblance of dignity, Pubright turned to Love, who looked as though he had just watched a lightning strike. "Observe, Love," the inspector murmured, "how truth can reveal itself not in confession, but in subtle hesitation. The canon's disappearance is accounted for not by accident, but by carefully orchestrated circumstance." Outside, the abbey remained serene, its stones unchanging and silent. Yet inside, a quiet understanding had taken root. The missing had not truly vanished, and the guilty had, at last, been silently unmasked. The parish hall, which only a week earlier had been draped with dahlias and humming with the faintly malicious cheer of the Garden Society, was back to its ordinary function. As a venue for jumble sales and rehearsals of the amateur operatic, no trace remained of the consternation that had spread from the vanished priest, except for the faint echo in conversation whenever two or more citizens of Flaxborough gathered near a pot of tea. Inspector Pubright, whose explanations had been offered without drama in the vestry the previous afternoon, returned quietly to his desk. The missing Father O'Malley, it transpired, had not been abducted by foreign agents, nor spirited away by cloaked figures from forgotten orders. Instead, he had been persuaded, gently but firmly, into a period of silence by Brother Mallard, who had tired of the priest's discreet but nonetheless genuine excursions into parishioners' savings clubs. The Reverend's temporary concealment within the Abbey's unused south wing had been Mallard's misguided solution. Better to dampen scandal with absence than let whispers grow with detail. The scandal, of course, had grown regardless. Yet Pubright, by drawing together threads from Mrs. Complin's over-keen eye, Miss Banbury's envy-fueled gossip, and the recollections of the Eight Bells' snug, had unfolded a picture at once simple and ridiculous. The priest had not run off with anyone's money, only borrowed and misplaced it in ways that, left unchecked, would have led to unpleasantness for all concerned. A discreet repayment, facilitated by the Abbey and recorded with the most cautious of notations in Purbright's report, was already underway. Now, as the town returned to its rhythms, the whole episode was sinking into that peculiarly English. category of events considered better not dwelt upon. Mrs. Complin resumed her botanical triumphs. Miss Banbury declared she had never thought the priest quite steady. Mr. Clay returned to speculating on tombolas, and the Snug of the Eight Bells adopted a new story involving an unfortunate grocer and a crate of vanishing cabbages. In the police station, Pubright drafted his paperwork in the patient, rounded script that suggested a man more clerk than sleuth. His sergeant, ever eager for conclusions grander than the facts allowed, ventured to say it had been a tidy case of concealment and scandal. Pubright, without looking up, remarked only, "It was a case of people being much as they always are, love." He added a final full stop to his report, straightened the pile of forms, and reached for the next file in the tray. Outside, the market square chimed the hour in the same comfortable tones it always had. The town, once again, was itself, though just a little more cautious in its savings, and perhaps a little more watchful of priests who looked flustered in parish halls.